life and learning, the lawn, the rotunda, the pavilions, and the student rooms along the lawn, right? What's missing are the gardens, the hotels, and the ranges. They're just not part of the image. So again, I love this image for all it tells us about the university and that project. So this image, right, is 19th century branding about the university and this blissful space that it's imagining. So this is great. But it says other buildings we really wonder about. And this speaks to how Jefferson designs landscapes. So, right, this is a university founded on an abandoned farm. It's a university founded in a center of plantation agriculture. It's a university designed by a man whose entire life is largely spent, right, on his own plantation at Monticello nearby. So I'm going to run through just a few images to give you a sense of what plantation landscapes normally look like. So this is Mulberry Grove. This is Port Wentworth, Georgia. This is circa 1790. And what you'll notice is you have the large, right, big house, the plantation dwelling at the center of the landscape, and then immediately adjacent to it and quite visible to visitors approaching or work at the house. This is a very common landscape, right? So it's a landscape of surveillance. It's a landscape of demonstrating your wealth and power, right, through the visibility of the enslaved. So this is typically what we see in these plantation landscapes across the South. Many of you have been up to Montpelier. If you haven't been recently, please go. It has an amazing exhibit. But this is another example. This is Montpelier with the reconstructed enslaved village. So even here in Virginia, the enslaved village where the enslaved live and work is a feature of the landscape that's very visible to people as you're coming up the Grand Drive to, in this case, Madison's house, or as you're sitting on the back porch. It's there, it's visible, you can see it, and it's partly about surveillance and partly about a demonstration of your planter power. This is an image from Alabama. This is a cotton plantation in Alabama. So this is even after UVA opens. This is a later image, but you'll see in the distance the two-story big house with a balcony on both levels with the working plantation right all around it and perfectly visible in every direction. Again, a landscape of surveillance and positioning the enslaved as a demonstration of your power in that landscape. So this is typically what you see on plantations. Here at Monticello, and again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image. At Monticello, we see something very, very different, right? He is coming up with a different design. So if you're thinking about the west lawn here at Monticello, it functions a bit like the lawn, right? The enslaved village is completely absent from this image, and it's intentional in the way that he has designed it. And it speaks to that same ambivalence I talked about in the first video, right? So the big house occupies the highest ground, right? It commands your attention. It's an expression of Jefferson's wealth and taste and power, but the enslaved village is nowhere to be found. And again, this is about that ambivalence of slavery. So I'm going to do kind of an aerial image here, right? The black U-shaped item in the center is Monticello with the two wings coming out. And right, that's situated on the high ground. But right nearby, we see the enslaved village. It's all along Mulberry Row, but he has used landscape elevation topography and careful crafting of that land to create one view that you see as a guest at Jefferson's house up top, but one that he can still see and surveil if he needs to. So he's hiding the kind of life and work of the enslaved in really strategic ways at Monticello, and he's going to do the same thing at UVA. So I think this is another iconic image. You can see the west lawn there, and to the right, Mulberry Row, right? Very close to the house, but obscured by the drop in elevation, obscured by the creation of those wings, and then obscured by the trees and vegetation. So he has spaces where he can go and surveil that plantation landscape below, but as a guest, you might not ever see it. And these are two images, right? The image on the right is out on the west lawn, looking at one of the wings. The image on the left is down below when you're near the weaver's cottage. And right, he's tucked away into the elevation. He's tucked away the kitchen and that underground dependency passageway that runs fully under the house, where the wine cellar is, where the dumbwaiter runs, right? He's tucked all of the life and labor of the enslaved underground, and then again, hidden from view of the folks who he might be entertaining as guests. So he's trying to minimize the visibility of slavery even at his own house. And this speaks to that, again, that ambivalence about slavery. So this brings us back to UVA, right? What's visible and what's not visible and what's missing. And here's another image where you really can't see what's going on beyond the lawn. And right in this image, the pavilions appear to be two-story structures, right? And I know everyone on this call is familiar with this. The first story were classrooms. The second stories were where professors lived with their families and students lived along the ground level in those rooms. But there's a lot more going on that's using kind of landscape and elevation in much the same way. And so it's hard to see when we go to the Maverick plan from 1822 how he's using this landscape. So I'm hoping this talk will get you to think about the way elevation plays a role here, and he does some really fascinating architectural tricks to do the same stuff he's done at Monticello, to bury the work of slavery down hills and underground in some really strategic ways. So the first thing he does is create these spaces, right? These are the gardens. I've kind of marked them off in orange. Each garden is connected directly to a pavilion, right? A house that is run by a professor, or in the case of the ranges, a hotel, which is a dining hall that's outsourced to someone who runs it, who feeds the students there, and then manages care of the student rooms. And all this is really a story about enslaved people. And so the gardens, he leaves the gardens unclear, but he understands that the professors and the hotel keepers are almost certainly going to have enslaved people, and they're going to need a place for them to do work. And so he's going to try to tuck that work inside gardens behind these walls so that it's not as fully visible to his students. And again, I think this speaks to that ambivalence about slavery. It speaks to a desire to minimize the visibility of slavery so that his student project can succeed, and his students hopefully won't be corrupted by slavery. Of course, I think the joke's on him here. The students that came to UVA, the first class in 1825, 35 of them were from Albemarle County out of 123. Nearly every other student came from a center of concentrated slaveholding. So if they were corrupted by slavery, it had happened at home long before they arrived at UVA. This is an image of the east side, right, looking back up from the ranges. This is an early 20th century image. The serpentine walls are gone. Right, the early version of what we now know as contemplative gardens is already in place, but you get a sense of the way he's using elevation, particularly on that east side, to kind of hide this landscape. So you'll notice, it's a little hard to make out in the image, but now the pavilions have 3 stories, right? And it's that third story, the basement story on both sides that's tucked underground, that is where he is imagining some of the life and labor of the enslaved will go on, and then in these garden spaces with those walls recreated. So this is my other favorite image of early UVA. And this is great. You get a sense of what Charlottesville and Albemarle were like. Right? You can see this is 1856. You can see Charlottesville growing in the distance. But when the university opens, it's a small town. It's not a big place. It's not a prominent, it doesn't seem destined for prominence. So the university and Charlottesville will grow together. And by this point in 1856, they didn't apparently know how to draw to scale. I love this. The rotunda had to be the biggest building anybody in the area had ever seen because it's a rural, agricultural, plantation-based economy. But what's really interesting is if you zoom in on the academical village, you see something that's gone on. Jefferson's created a landscape that he's attempting to minimize where enslaved people will live and work, but he's not really thought about where they'll live and work or how people will actually occupy this space. An architect once told me that architects all design buildings as if it's always noon, sunny, 77, and pleasant. So right, Jefferson is probably guilty of this as well. So if we zoom in a bit here on those, what you'll notice is notice all the buildings. Buildings litter these gardens after they open, building after building after building. And this starts almost immediately after professors move into pavilions. And these buildings are all stories about slavery. They're kitchens, right? So there's a kitchen in the basement. This is part of Jefferson's design, but it's directly beneath the classroom. Every professor almost immediately builds a kitchen dependency. So they build a new building outside. They're going to claim basement space as living space, move the work of the enslaved more fully into the gardens by building those buildings. Some of the gardens even had kind of brick paved areas where work could go on. So you can see clearly how they're becoming living and workspaces for the enslaved. This is, again, this isn't even complete, but if you look here, we're back to the Maverick plan. Most of the buildings you see in light gray, many of which are in the gardens, are buildings, again, they're kitchens that were sometimes both kitchens with attic garrets where enslaved people lived, or a second story to house the enslaved, smokehouses, bunk houses. So this is all a story about slavery that's meant where they're largely meant to be tucked inside the garden walls, out of sight of what's happening, the educational space on the lawn. What did it look like when it opened? And this is really important to that memorial. This is an 1830 image. I'm going to thank Ben Ford from Ravenna Archaeology for sharing this image with me. This is an image superimposed on an 1850s map of university property. So bear with me, the names that you see on the original map do not line up to the occupancy we're looking at, but you get a sense of what this landscape, who lived in this landscape, right? Nearly every building, the majority of people living in the building are in fact enslaved people. Right? So you see Hotel A has 28 enslaved people either living in it or attached to it, so likely living in the gardens. And nearly every pavilion functions the same way, that every professor moves in and quickly, even if they came from Europe or the North, quickly adopts slavery as, right, the mode of having household assistants. So they all purchase enslaved people. And you can see that sometimes these numbers are quite large, right? 3 professors in 1830 had almost 20 enslaved people living with them attached to that pavilion. So this 1830 stands as a model where you have 133 students in that year and 158 enslaved people living at the university. This is the model that carries out pretty much until you get to the late 1840s, when the university begins to expand its student body. The enslaved population won't grow after that. So by 1860, it's nearly 600 students, but always between 100 and 200 enslaved people. And that's always an approximate estimate, right? That's only what we can identify as attached to a professor, to the university, or to a hotel keeper. So what's really important here is these are people. And you heard a little bit about this in the talk. We are lucky to have some images of enslaved people. We are working now on creating a whole website for the memorial that will allow us to really tell some more of their stories more fully. But I thought it would be good to end on how the memorial is attempting to recenter the lives and stories of the enslaved into the history and memory of the university as people, right, who not only built but maintained those very spaces we were just looking at. They're people with hopes, dreams, and aspirations. They had families, they yearned for freedom, they were Americans, and they had names. Again, we may never be able to name all of them, but being able to name some of them is really important. So working clockwise from top left, the first image is William Gibbons. He's the first Black minister in the independent Black church in Charlottesville. I talked about him in the previous video. Next, moving clockwise, top is Peter Briggs. He was enslaved at the university and then worked as a wage worker at the university until his death in the early 20th century. We've already talked about Isabella Gibbons, top right here of the image. She was the first teacher of color in the Freedmen's School in Charlottesville after the war. Lower right is Henry Martin, whom was known to generations of UVA students after the war as the faithful slave. That's not who he was. I want to be really clear, but that's how he was remembered by UVA students as they were building the Jim Crow state. Henry Martin, we believe, was born at Monticello the day Jefferson died. He, as part of the many estate sales breaking up Jefferson's estate, was sold to the Carr family. He lived and worked at Bentivar in Albemarle County until he was rented to Mrs. Dabney Carr in 1847, which brought him to what is now, we now know as Carr's Hill, but at that point it wasn't Carr's Hill. It had a boarding house on it that Mrs. Carr ran. He worked there until emancipation as a dining room servant and delivered coal and firewood. And then after the war was one of the first workers at the university, and he worked here until his death in 1915. So he rang the bell in the rotunda and attended the rotunda for nearly 50 years. The middle bottom picture is Sally Cottrell Cole. She was enslaved at Monticello, purchased at Jefferson's estate sale by math professor Thomas Key, who is from London, hated Virginia, hated the provincial Virginia enslaving attitudes, didn't like the students and couldn't wait to leave. He purchased Lucy Cottrell after renting her from whomever, I don't have the name, purchased her at the estate sale. And then made sure when he left UVA, and he is the exception to the rule, he set her up in freedom so that he freed her and made sure that she was protected after she was free. She continued to live at the university working as a cook for another year, and then moved off grounds and worked as a seamstress near grounds after marrying as a free person. And then last, in the lower left-hand corner, is Lucy Cottrell, a relative of Sally Cottrell Coles. She's pictured in that picture in 1855. She is newly freed. She is holding Professor George Bladerman's grandchild. So she was enslaved at Monticello, purchased by Bladerman at the estate sale, ultimately worked as a cook in Pavilion 4 until Bladerman was dismissed from the university. And I like always to end with her because she fits with my image we started with, right? It brings us back to here. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, Pavilion 9 on the south balcony, there's an enslaved woman holding a professor's child. So, right, even in the idyllic cult image of UVA in the 1850s, slavery is hidden in plain sight, and that she's standing right there. Here's the zoom in picture. So, right, this was a common image that we saw in slavery. So people often had their enslaved servants hold their children and take pictures. So I want to end here and say, right, this memorial and the work of the commission is a culmination of a process that started a decade ago, right? It was started by students and alumni who pushed the university to tell this story and to do more and consider a memorial. And then it was brought to a reality by the President's Commission on Slavery and University. And I'm not going to give a full shout out, but it looked like at least a couple of my colleagues on this commission are here in attendance today, beyond Andrea and I thank them for joining us and helping us bring this to a reality. So I hope you see the memorial and our work as a beginning, right? It's the beginning of an ongoing coming to terms with some difficult truths about UVA's past, about the local past. It's also the beginning of an evolving conversation with the broader local community about how we acknowledge and atone for that past. So thus, I think our work necessarily continues. So I'm gonna get rid of my screen here and bring in Dr. Andrea Douglas. She's the executive director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center and the co-chair with me of the President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation. So for 8 years, she has been here in the trenches with me on this work. So thank you. Really looking forward to your questions.
Yes, at this point, we are opening Q&A. So if you feel, feel free to engage, unmute, you can absolutely ask question, or if you feel like you need to send in through the chat box, I'll be more than happy to facilitate as well.
So while we're all waiting for that, I thought I'd maybe say a few things just so that it's not sort of this dead silence as we wait. As Kurt said, I've been on this project for 8 years with the original commission. I was both on the memorialization committee, the original steering committee, the memorialization committee, and then ultimately the community engagement committee. And I think that, as you probably will hear us say over and over again, and as Kurt has already said, the community engagement piece of this is one of what I believe what makes this project the most successful. If you start to think about, as we start to talk about who even the architects or the architecture firm that was chosen to do the project, one of the things while we were in meeting, in the looking at the various proposals, one of the things that people were struck by was how many different kinds of monuments they had built. And in some ways, it seemed a little bit disjointed. But even at that very most basic point of the start of creating the monument, what really was being evidenced was the capacity for this particular group to do the kind of community engagement that then would create objects that were specific to that site. So you would look at something like the memorial to that is out in front of MIT to the police officer that was murdered during the Boston Marathon slayings, right? And this is this amazing 5-starred, really architectural, well-balanced object compared to something that they had done in Oslo that was also very unique and different. And so the ability to say, yes, this particular organization was one that would be able to articulate this wasn't really apparent, but ultimately, I think we made the right choice when we think about what the process actually turned out to be from start to finish. The other thing that I want to also add to that, in terms of thinking about monuments at the university, this is not the only monument to the period of enslavement. There is also the Kitty Foster Monument that's over on the South Lawn. So you really also have to think about this object in relationship to some other objects, and also in relationship to a kind of curatorial space, which, being a curator, that's what I do. I think about these things in that kind of way. And so we're speaking about not just a single object, but a process that, yes, started with students, but began to manifest itself in our space as real sort of memorial, off-ground memorial that had physical relationships to bodies and ideas as early as 2011 when that Kitty Foster object went in. It is a shadow box, it's a dream catcher, it marks the location of graves. And so, you know, I have done recently a talk about those objects that in our own Charlottesville landscape that speak to the presence of African-American people. And so as a project, I think not only thinking about the memorial, but thinking about a longer stretch of project. How do we see and interpret that not as a culmination, but a next step to galvanizing a set of ideas, I think is also very elegantly described in the monument. And elegantly described, I think, in the process. The African American Heritage Center was created to literally pick up from 1865 and take this history forward. We, Isabella Gibbons walked out of enslavement, had her own school, and then was taken on as a student by Anna Gardner, who was the person who came to Charlottesville to found the Freedom School. And so she is a very important linchpin figure for the history of enslavement at the university, but also for the history of post-emancipation and community development in Charlottesville. And so, you know, you see her as sort of this pivotal person in both of these narratives. And so again, fitting that her eyes are the ones that are on the monument, fitting that it is the community that helps to make those kinds of decisions in the overall process, and that we engage with the community as we move from one commission into the next. I think that's the one thing that we held on tightly to as a best practice, was to always be, and here I sit now next to Kurt, slugging out as the co-chair of the commission. And I think that is a clear reflection of our understanding and taking forward some of the lessons that we learned over the course of the last few years. So I think that's what I wanted to say about it all.
Thank you very much. I do see we do have a couple of questions in there. Where is the water feature going to be on the memorial? That was the first one.
So the water feature runs over the lower inner ring. So it's a bench, and then on the interior is the timeline, and the water feature will run across the timeline around that inner ring.
Thank you so much. Given how few names we have of the enslaved population at UVA, how were we able to locate descendants, and how many descendants are we aware of?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about here. What's interesting is simply doing this work and telling the truth. Sometimes descendants find you because you're telling the truth and doing the honest work. So in 2015, when we dedicated Gibbons Hall, the Gibbons dorm, right? We met several Gibbons descendants. When we dedicated Skipwith Hall in 2017, about 30 Skipwith descendants attended. So just over the process of this work, we began to connect with descendants. We have a lot of work to do there. We've had running for just over a year. It's unclear how long it's going to run, but we have a descendant outreach project that's meant to build a list of names of descendants. And we have a genealogist working to help them trace ancestry. And that work has already produced, we're working on a plan for how to add names to the memorial, but we will add names. I doubt we'll ever get anywhere close to 4,000 names, but we'll be able to add probably a couple dozen over the next couple of years if this work continues. I'm not sure off the top of my head how many descendants we've connected to exactly, but it's approaching 100 different families. And unsurprisingly, right, slavery moves people around, and really, right, there's a diaspora of enslavement. So if you follow the Now Center's Black Virginians in Blue project, which is looking at people who were enslaved in Albemarle County and then fought for the Union, there's a diaspora that stretches all across the United States, and we're finding much the same thing. Some of the people we've been in contact with are in Canada. So the descendant group that we are working with I think it's going to continue to grow, and it's not confined to locally. Though we've known all along, right, we live in a community where there are descendants of people enslaved at UVA that might actually work at UVA, or were educated there and still live in the community, right? So this is really more of the university discovering what lots of local people already knew and understood.
Thank you, Kurt. Was the Charlottesville community originally welcoming of this proposed memorial, or was there anger as well?
I don't, I think one of the things, again, going back to the design process, I think the design group had already had such great experience with how to create and develop a process that would work. There was also a team of local, Frank Dukes was a part of that design group, and he had already had a lot of experience working in the community. So there was a really good bridge that had already existed. Many of the events that were that happened around the monument happened at the Heritage Center. And as a consequence, we've spent the last we've been in existence since 2013, and we spent much of the time building the space as a place where the community comes to have certain kinds of conversations, knowing that it's a safe site, knowing that it's a site where the dialogue is around race. We're used to it. The people who are engaging it are used to it. And as Kurt intimated, the Charlottesville as a community of African-American people is very much engaged in studying their own history. There are at least 3 genealogy groups that are in some form engaged with each other. They overlap. So the Burke Brown Stepp genealogy group, the Central Virginia historical researchers, and then also an African-American genealogy group. And when Kurt speaks to the fact that, you know, one of the main articles was 20 years ago, this is the body of people that had been working on this for all of that time. So I believe that the notion of a monument was well received. It's the process of ensuring that the monument said exactly what it needed to say and responded in the broadest, both speaking locally and then talking about the sort of universal idea of enslavement and what that meant. Those were the places, I think, where we would find discussion. And if you want to call anything tension, it was really about trying to drive to bringing something that people could feel most satisfied with. Kurt, what do you think about that?
No, I completely agree. And in the video we started with, my memory is, and I think this was in 2014, we learned two things at the very first community engagement workshop at the Jefferson School. And I tell everybody the story, right? I'm a historian. I saw my job on this is to go into the archives and do the research, and that's what I was going to be happiest doing. My work on this has been an 8-year education in the importance and power of the community conversation. And I've been dragged into this, and it's been wonderful. And at that first meeting, two things happened. One person stood up, and I edited the comment. It was slightly more colorful, but it was, you better darn well build a memorial. It better be big, it better be visible, and it better be accessible. Right? Well, heard that loud and clear. The next comment that really sticks with me, I remember it was yesterday, it was a man getting up and basically weeping when talking about Gospel Hill, right? This is the neighborhood that the new university hospital is built on, and he was among one of the last families. One day they just evicted everyone and UVA bulldozed the neighborhood. And this was a moment for me, and I think everyone on the commission, that, right, this isn't a story about 1865. The slavery ends in 1865, but the very story we were uncovering and telling the truth about has really long arms that reach all the way to the present, and we better be really attentive to that. And I think that sort of shaped how we talked about our work, and I'm at least hopeful. I can't speak for the local community, but my sense has been they're glad to see us doing that, and they're glad to see the work continuing, that you can't kind of wall off and isolate slavery as something that ended 150 years ago, right? It's not the distant past. It shapes our very present in profound ways.
Yeah, and also to add to that, that the process that also led up to the monument, there were, beyond the building naming, there were actual sort of events that people could participate in, where people could, you know, the memorial that happened at the gravesite of enslaved people. Those real sort of moments where people could come together and mourn, could commune, could understand more plainly the visceral nature of enslavement at the university. I think those also, by the time you get to the point where you're talking monumentalization, we've had a few experiences that had brought us to that place. And not to also to mention that it didn't take 15 years to build a monument, right? I've been trying to raise money for a monument to Vinegar Hill since 2010. Whether that monument will ever get built is questionable. The idea that you can decide to build a monument and then go ahead and do it within a short period of time, that's not how monuments usually go, you know? Even when you think about the one that they built at Brown or the one that they built in New York, these are much longer processes than the one that at the university. And I think time is an important factor in that as well. It suggested intentionality and seriousness of purpose.
Thank you, Andrea and Kurt. And is the idea that as the new names are discovered, they can be added to the wall?
Yes, the process hasn't been laid out yet, but yes, I think there'll be a once yearly adding of names. We're building a process now so that there's some sort of committee that includes Descendants that will vet whether the name should be added or not. And that's ongoing, but yeah, that's the plan. And I know already we've had descendants come to us and know that the research project, right, wasn't about creating a name list for the memorial. It was about telling the story of slavery at UVA. And we had to finish that up and write a report in 2018. And then we got to the memorial. And so we've had to kind of back up, and it's been interesting. There's this research project spiders out of the UVA archives very quickly to sometimes some far-flung locations. And so we've already had descendants come to us. We have several names that we know need to be added. And I still continue to work kind of part-time with some graduate students going through faculty letter collections, and we found names there as well. So yes, there'll probably be a once yearly event where we add a series of names. I'm going to guess at this point that we have 6 or 7 names in the first year that we know will be added to the memorial.
Thank you. And one comment came in that I have not previously heard about the gravesite and a memorial there. Where is this?
Oh, so this is great. There are multiple graveyards at UVA, right? So if you, the one we're talking about here is the Enslaved Graveyard that is north of the UVA cemetery. So it's really part of a 3-cemetery complex. It's hidden kind of back behind Lefevre Hall in that pathway that runs down into the dell. So it's tucked away, and it was rediscovered in 2012 when they were preparing to do a university cemetery expansion to the north. And they did an archaeological survey, found 67 grave shafts. And we did a little research project. We don't know much about it. There are only a couple references to that being where enslaved people were buried. Because of the archaeological survey, we knew at least the northern extent of it, and we knew that there was a wooden paled fence around it. So it's been reinterpreted with fencing. It has plaques as you come in and interpretive panels that kind of show you what it looked like, and a list of names of people we can identify who died while at UVA who may be buried there, but we have no records on it. And what the commission did was twice, with 2 major symposia in 2014 and 2017, is do a memorial and libation service in the evening. So several hundred people in attendance, and it included a candlelight vigil walking into the cemetery led by Reverend Almeda Miller, who did a traditional libation. They're really beautiful, powerful moments. And I think Andrea was talking about, we need to do more of these things, right? These meaningful rituals of remembrance are really a way to make this part of, right, our lived public memory about this, right? If we put up all the signs we want, the cemetery is a perfect example of this. We put up signage, we have a walking tour map and an app that takes you around all these sites, and people still don't know it exists. So we're actually working on revamping the UVA cemetery pamphlet. If you've ever been out there, it's basically a list of kind of the white professors who were buried there. And we really wanted it. We need to talk about all 3 cemeteries there, right? There's the Confederate cemetery where soldiers who died in the Charlottesville General Hospital are buried, about 1,000 burials there. There's the University Cemetery, and then this Enslaved Cemetery. And that's only one of 3 cemeteries where African Americans are buried at the university. There's another cemetery in front of Gooch Dillard that we won't be able to identify 9 burials there. That cemetery was almost certainly enslaved people who were buried from the Piedmont Plantation, which ran from there over the hill toward the Fontaine Avenue Research Park. And then there are, I think, 35 burials at the Kitty Foster site that Andrea mentioned earlier. This is over by now Gibson Hall, right? And that has been, same thing, interpreted, and the grave shafts are visible there. So there are several, and again, our walking tour map and app will lead you on that. I'm sorry I don't have the link, but I'll make sure we get it to you. You can download an app on your phone and take this tour as well as more tours, and the Segregation Commission will have more tours coming out on that as a way to kind of explore this history in place.
Thank you, Kurt. Are there still plans to repurpose the Cracker Box for a teaching display site on the lawn?
So it's actually McGuffy Cottage, and that's a great question. Right, it was in the initial Board of Visitors approval for the memorial. It included a possible future program of reclaiming McGuffy Cottage, which was built as a duplex for enslaved people. And I'm going to call it a duplex. It doesn't mean 2 family units lived in it, but it was 2 separate one-room dwellings attached, right? It is still standing. It's just to the south and west of Pavilion 9. And right now it's hidden from the lawn, and we hope to, in the future, again, this is the problem with these commissions, right? The commission is done, the sun has set on the commission. So I think this is incumbent on all of us to sort of keep asking the question, why haven't you done that? I think there's a real opportunity to move the ADA access ramp and the boxwoods that are blocking it from view and sort of, right, bring it into the lawn and create it either as another small interpretive center about slavery, or even one of the things we've talked about is, what if this were actually both an interpretive center and a space where an artist in residence held public events every year? So, right, poetry readings, sculpture, any number of things. You could have a gathering area right there just off the lawn, visible from the lawn, that would draw people in and tell the story. We'd still like to do that, but right now, I don't think that's on the front burner anywhere. I wish it were.
Thank you, Kurt. Do you envision that there will continue to be a growing library of stories for enslaved people and their families? Will it be digitally available as a resource?
Yes, there's a project going on right now to build a website just for the memorial. And we're working on, many of the names on the memorial actually come from financial records, which as digitized items are really not interesting to look at, right? These are large 19th century accounting ledgers. They follow double entry bookkeeping to the extent that there's a debit page and a credit page. And if you're familiar with UVA history, the first proctor, Arthur Brockenbrough, was accused of lining his own pockets. And it's hard in looking at those records to not think they were right. But anything they did would fail an accounting test today. And so we're working on digitizing those and then creating not so much screenshots of the originals, but a kind of database that will allow you to know, how do we know what this name on the memorial is? And that's what that website will ultimately do. And we're working on as well where we can tell a detailed story, telling a detailed story about an individual's life as the name appears there. But sadly, right, with over 3,000 unnamed individuals, we will never be able to tell their stories. And even in the case of many of the named individuals, sometimes we only have a single instance where we have a first name. We may never get to being able to tell much of a story about them. And that's part of what slavery was doing, right? It was denying humanity and treating people as, right, it was about labor, but as machines, right? The term you see in those financial records most often is hand, right? Refer to an enslaved person as a hand. And a hand is a tool, right? It's disembodied from humanity. We're going to struggle to tell many of the stories, unfortunately.
Thank you, Kurt. And is there a date planned for the Descendants to turn on the water feature of the memorial?
Yes, it's scheduled. So it was originally scheduled for April, right before Founders Day in 2020. But the pandemic has really upset lots of our plans. So it is still scheduled for 2021. And it's yet to be determined whether it will. It's going to happen definitely in April 2021, either as a live event in person, if conditions change and we can do that, or as maybe a partially hybrid event. But I think in all likelihood, as some sort of online event. So the Descendants will bless and turn on the water feature as part of that, and there'll be then a full-blown dedication event attached with that.
And one last question came in. Who were they trying to hide the practice of slavery from?
Well, I think it's two things, right? It's Jefferson's ambivalence, right? He understands that slavery is evil, but he sees it as a necessary evil. And he has a real failure of imagination in imagining what a post-slavery world would look like, right? he opines a bit about, right, deportation projects. The only way he can imagine slavery ending is if all people of color are removed from the United States. So I think one of it's that ambivalence. He does it at Monticello just to hide it. It makes him uncomfortable. I think the second piece is he's really thinking about his imagined citizens his university is creating, right? By 1821, he's actually, right, becoming a bit more conservative in his older years. He's much less interested in people that just become, they're idle and they become pests, right? So his kind of interests, and I think the primary one is slavery. So he's not becoming a pro-slavery ideologue, but he's certainly imagining that the university will create an engaged citizenry who will protect the material interests of slavery. And if he's going to do that, he somehow doesn't want slavery to corrupt his students. So he's busy building, imagining at least, or designing a landscape that maybe will minimize the presence of the enslaved. And know that it all falls apart when people move in, right? Enslaved people don't hide in the gardens. The first person every student sees every morning is an enslaved person who comes to their room and lights their fire and shines their shoes and cleans the room, right? So that all breaks down. The privies are located in the gardens. So even students have to enter enslaved workyards to go to the bathroom. So it all breaks down in reality, but in his idealization as a design, he's imagining he's creating a landscape where students will not see slavery quite so much and thereby perhaps be less corrupted and despotic.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I think we'll take one last question. What are some of the things we all can do to help this work continue?
I think the big thing is, right, and Andrea, chime in here, it's ask the question, right? When if you're with the president, if you're at any of these meetings, ask people, like, what are we doing next? There's a lot more we can do. And no, back in 2013, people you understandably approach this from a fear-based perspective, right? That it's going to be bad for the brand. It's going to be bad for the UVA to talk about unpleasant stories. They're hard stories, but it's good history, right? And it's actually good for the university, right? If we are going to follow truth fearlessly wherever it may lead, that requires examining everything about our own institution. And really, that's what we're doing. And so I think it's good as, alumni and professors and people at UVA just to ask the question, hey, what are we doing next, right? We have a lot more stories to tell. And if we want to make this university, right, fully achieve its stated long-term, right, historical values and its very clear 21st century values, it's going to take all of us continually asking the question, hey, what else are we doing?
Thank you so
much. Yeah, I think also, asking the question is one thing, but also sort of giving us the space to continue to sort of create those opportunities for this history to become most visible. So I'd like to even be more emphatic about what that question ought to be, is that if you're asked, you want to see an exhibition space, you want to see us begin to sort of physically engage with this in a location where people can do more than just walk around and look at buildings, but they're really sort of creating seeing a cohesive story. Because I think that's where Kurt and I would like to see it. We'd really like to see some of this work live in a physical location where the artifacts can be observed that are not digitized necessarily, but something that adds to the experience in that physical space of the monument. So, for me, I want that little museum to show up somewhere, to be honest. So.
Well, and Andrea, this is great. I wanted to add, and everybody who was involved in the commission, we kept talking about this. We hoped that when all of this work was done, it would be impossible for a casual visitor to the university to not come here, right? And this is not come here and go on a tour. we have people pass through this landscape every day, and for them to have to encounter this history and understand it, that it tells a multiplicity of stories, and that slavery was part of that story. And we're definitely not there yet, right? You can still pass through the university and miss all of this. Know that there are plans to do some work in one of the gardens to kind of start to let it be, right, let the old garden become visible, because the gardens, and I bet you everyone on here, right, you have a favorite spot in your favorite garden where you sit and read a book or just smell the flowers, right? I do. They're amazing, but right, they're creative fictions created in the 50s and 60s where they kind of lined up two things, right? There were called gardens. Jefferson loved formal gardens, ergo they must have been formal gardens. And they weren't. And so we have to now deal with that reality that has the sacred cult tradition about it. We can't get rid of those gardens. But I'd really like to see one of them perhaps start to retell this story and be used a little differently. And I think there are plans in the works for that through the Office of the Architect.
Kurt and Andrea, thank you so much. I would like to invite Jan Baumer, President of the Board of the Colonnade Club, for concluding remarks, please.
There we go. I'm finally unmuted.
Oh.
Well, Kurt and Andrea, I thank you so much. What an enlightening presentation, and what a perfect Cornerstone presentation where, you know, the Colonnade Club, we know we were, as Jerry said at the beginning of the program, the starting point for much of the University of Virginia. And I am so thrilled that we're broadening our focus and we're putting things in context in a way that we haven't done in the past, and that we're addressing sometimes challenging truths, but that we are fearlessly stepping forward. And to Andrea's point, I think you're right. We not only ask the question, but we ask for it to be visible and, you know, from both of your perspectives, an integral part of what the experience and the life is that the university, that people encounter. So we thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening presentation and a great afternoon, and we thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes our historic commemoration. And thank you to all the Colonnade Club members for joining. We truly appreciate it, and look forward to see you at the next event. Take care.
Thanks to the club.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Thank you. This was great. Bye.